You'd think the Wild West was all gunfights and glory, but the real survivalists. They were the quiet ones who made lunch-mended trousers and kept the children from falling into outhouses. I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight we slip past the saloons and shootouts to meet the cooks, teachers, and laundresses who built the West without ever firing a shot. It's funny, history loves a loud hero, but survival often belongs to the boring. Beneath the dust and legend lies a very different frontier. Picture a schoolhouse made from split logs where lessons were taught beside the scent of boiling stew. Imagine a woman scrubbing laundry with lye soap in a river she shares with a horse, a boy, and 3 suspiciously still fish. Why did they choose this life, and what held it all together when the myths stopped working? If you like your history with fewer duels and more dish pans, maybe like and subscribe. Not for me. For the ghosts of forgotten postmasters and biscuit bakers who kept people alive long enough to be remembered. Oh, and if you're listening with half-closed eyes, I'm curious who's your favorite overlooked figure from history's background. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the shadow of the cowboy's silhouette rode the real glue of frontier towns, ordinary folks with unglamorous jobs who turned chaotic wilderness into something resembling society. You step into a settlement that doesn't have a sheriff, but it does have a widow who bakes 7 loaves of bread a day, and a teacher who boards with her and grades papers by candlelight between hauling her own water. Here you meet the town's laundress. She's not famous. No one draws her pistol in murals, but she scrubs the shirts of men who think they're legends, and without her, the saloon would stink far worse than just spilled whiskey. She charges extra for socks. People pay. You walk past the jail, usually empty, and into the town's general store. The man behind the counter isn't a gunslinger, but he might be more powerful. He decides who gets flour, who gets coffee, and who has to settle for molasses. He keeps notes in a worn leather ledger, and you realize the true currency of this town isn't bullets, it's credit. Outside, children chase a hoop down a rutted street, while a tired schoolteacher hollers spelling words at them. She's barely 20, arrived last month from Ohio, and hasn't figured out how to keep the boys from trying to catch squirrels during arithmetic. Still, she's the highest educated person for 50 miles, and the parents trust her with their dreams of something better. It becomes clear that the West wasn't just settled by grit, it was organized by routine. These people held things together with soup and shoe repairs. The frontier wasn't conquered in a shootout. It was boiled clean hemmed straight and taught to sit still during geography lessons. Historians still debate whether these roles were undervalued or simply invisible by design. Some suggest we've glamorized the wrong people. Others argue that survival is its own kind of fame, quieter but more lasting. And as the sun sets behind the scrubby hills, you watch a cook ladle stew into a dented tin bowl, feeding the town's most feared outlaw, who it turns out can't make biscuits to save his life. Morning on the frontier smells like wood smoke, old coffee, and something charred that was probably meant to be bread. You step outside a sod-roof cabin and into the kind of crisp dryness that makes your nose suspicious. There's no running water. There's barely standing water. And yet, somehow people here manage to stay clean, sort of. Welcome to the era of buffalo chip hygiene. You blink in the early light as a woman crouches beside a dented basin, carefully pouring water she fetched 3 miles away into a cracked enamel pitcher. She uses it to rinse her face, then shares it with 3 children and 1 extremely dusty cat. It's a delicate choreography, enough to clean, not enough to waste. In the West, water isn't just life, it's a daily negotiation. You wander toward the outhouse where the wind carries more than just prairie air. Settlers built these far enough from the home to avoid the worst of the smell, but not so far that you'd risk a coyote encounter after dark. Every visit involves careful planning, lantern boots, and nerves of steel. Bathing was a group activity not always by choice. Most towns had one public bathhouse, if any, where a hot soak cost a nickel and privacy cost extra. Soap came in lye-based bricks that could remove paint or at least a few layers of skin. People scrubbed fast, dried faster, and tried to ignore the sound of strangers arguing through thin walls. Then there were the buffalo chips. If you're imagining baked goods, pause. Chips meant the dried droppings of bison used as fuel when trees were scarce. Settlers collected them by hand, especially children who turned it into a grim little game. The chips burned hot, didn't smoke much, and were surprisingly effective for boiling water. Dinner and bath night powered by poop. One early homesteader wrote of heating bath water with buffalo chips, while her baby crawled nearby chewing on a teething biscuit. The baby was clean by prairie standards, the biscuit questionable. Some scholars remain puzzled by just how rarely illness broke out, given these rough conditions. Others suggest immune systems simply adapted, or that dust was the real cleanser all along. It's also possible that fewer diseases spread simply because neighbors were quite literally miles apart. In towns, hygiene took on a social angle. You step into a boarding house where the owner insists on Saturday wash-ups whether guests want them or not. The communal tin tub sits in the kitchen, refilled with kettles of water and shared by whoever's next in line. Modesty existed, but practicality often overruled it. And yet, despite the scarcity, people made time to wash up for supper, to comb hair before church, to polish boots with bacon grease before walking into town. Cleanliness wasn't just comfort, it was dignity. Later, as the wind picks up dust again, you spot a mother brushing her daughter's hair with a carved wooden comb, both of them squinting into the sun. The girl wrinkles her nose. "You smell like onions," she says. "That's clean enough," the mother replies, grinning. Evening falls soft and amber across the town's one street, and the saloon doors creak open, not from drama, but from habit. No one's diving behind barrels. No pistols are drawn. Instead, you hear a different kind of tension, the clink of glass, the low murmur of gossip, and a card game, where the real danger is losing your last dollar before payday. Contrary to every Western film you've ever dozed through, saloons weren't always explosive. They were more often than not sleepy social centers. You step through the doors and into a haze of tobacco smoke, sour beer, and perfume that's seen better days. Behind the bar, a bored barkeep polishes glasses that haven't been properly cleaned since Tuesday. At one corner table, a prospector snores into his arm. At another, a pair of ranch hands argue over the rules of faro, a gambling game so confusing it may have been invented just to cause arguments. Over by the upright piano, missing 3 keys and tuned to somewhere near the key of yawn, a woman in a feathered hat gently hums a tune between sips of watered-down whiskey. You pass a chalkboard sign offering the week's entertainments, fiddling contest, poetry reading, and dancing weather permitting. Turns out the bar fights were rare. Most evenings featured more spilled beer than spilled blood. Patrons preferred card tricks over gun tricks. If you were lucky, the most dramatic moment all night was when someone's horse wandered into the building by mistake. Some saloons had libraries. Yes, libraries. Shelves of dusty novels and local newspapers where cowboys caught up on stories while nursing a beer. In one famous example, a Kansas barkeep refused to serve anyone who hadn't read at least one article that week. If you can't read, he reportedly said, "You can't drink here," a literacy test for lager. There's no scholarly consensus on how common such rules were, but records suggest many saloons doubled as informal post offices, polling stations, and even marriage venues. A man could walk in single and sober, and leave married and slightly confused. You take a seat near the piano where an elderly man is telling a story that starts with "back in '72", and never quite lands anywhere. No one minds. These were the hours people traded loneliness for warmth and silence for the soft rhythm of community. The saloon wasn't just a bar, it was a waiting room for the rest of life. Some historians argue that the quietness of real saloons has been erased on purpose, romanticized into shootouts and showdowns. Others suggest that the mundane truth simply didn't sell novels. But if you listen carefully, there's something comforting in the scratch of a match lighting a pipe, the slow slide of a shot glass, the whisper of boots on pine wood floors. And somewhere in the back, a bartender sighs as he fetches the mop, not for blood, but for the trail of muddy prints left by a dog who just really wanted to hear some music. The air smells like rain, but not the kind you're used to. This is prairie rain, and it carries the scent of churned soil, wet grass, and something strangely sweet, freshly soaked sod, walls. You step inside a frontier home where the roof grows weeds and the walls sprout mushrooms after a storm. Welcome to the humble marvel of the sod house. Out here trees are scarce and lumber costs more than a horse. So settlers turned to what was under their boots, literal chunks of earth. They cut blocks of tough prairie sod, thick with roots, and stacked them like bricks. No one pretended it was glamorous, but it was warm, quiet, and astonishingly sturdy. One woman wrote that her sod house withstood a tornado that flattened every wooden barn for miles. You walk across a dirt floor, soft from years of bare feet and sweeping. The walls are brown, crumbly, and slightly uneven. A curtain flaps lazily across the single window. The room is dim but cozy, like being inside a cave with floral wallpaper. On a shelf, a cracked teapot rests beside a stack of well-read newspapers, their edges curled from candle heat. These homes were marvels of thrift and necessity. A sod house could be built in a week, using just a spade, strong arms, and sheer stubbornness. It kept cool in summer, retained heat in winter, and muffled the howls of wind that seemed to always be arguing with the sky. Of course, it also leaked, and shed bugs, and occasionally snakes dropped in from the ceiling. Some scholars still debate whether these homes should be seen as temporary shelters or deliberate architectural adaptations. Either way, they represent a kind of frontier resilience that rarely makes it into the paintings. You watch a young couple finish patching a wall with fresh sod, their hands stained dark with soil. They don't speak much. There's comfort in the rhythm of their labor. Beside them, a baby naps in a hammock strung between two chairs, rocked slightly every time someone moves. Outside, chickens pick at the edges of the house, quite literally. Sod walls often became mini ecosystems sprouting wildflowers, moss, and even the occasional strawberry vine. In the spring, a house might bloom before its owners did. And the smell, there's no forgetting it. After a rain, the whole house emits a deep grassy aroma, like a meadow that decided to become domestic. It's soothing in a way modern homes never quite manage. You sit for a moment, breathing it in, listening to the wind argue with the roof and the creak of a kettle starting to boil. You wonder what it must have been like to come in here after a long sunburned day, dust in your teeth, ache in your bones, and be greeted by dirt walls that somehow meant safety. This place wasn't fancy, but it was earned, and it held. As twilight rolls across the plains, you spot a boy standing on the roof tossing pebbles at a crow. "Get off my bedroom," he mutters. The crow blinks unimpressed and stays exactly where it is. In a town with one general store, 3 last names, and 0 fashion sense, you wouldn't expect to find Parisian perfume or a collapsible coffin. But that's exactly what the catalog offered. Tonight you flip through the pages of 19th century mail-order dreams, where survival wasn't just about grit. It was about guessing the right size corset without trying it on. You walk into a settler's cabin where the most treasured possession isn't the rifle or the Bible. It's a dog-eared Sears, Roebuck & Coix catalog thicker than a brick and twice as entertaining. Children use it for alphabet lessons. Parents use it to fantasize about things they'll never afford. Teenagers secretly fold down the pages for items they don't understand but know are scandalous. Mail order companies transformed the isolated frontier into something faintly connected to the modern world. Need a stove, a wedding dress, a prosthetic leg. Just send a letter and wait 4 to 6 weeks, assuming the railroad hasn't skipped your town again. You sit beside a woman writing her order by candlelight. She carefully circles a butter churn, a tin bathtub, and a set of matching porcelain plates that, to her, scream civilized. She adds a note requesting blue if available, although she knows full well the warehouse workers will send whatever color they have. It doesn't matter. The plates will be the first matching set she's owned. Catalogs weren't just practical, they were aspirational. Some included entire house kits shipped in pieces with instructions, nails and pre-cut lumber. Build a mansion in 3 weeks, promise the fine print optimistically ignoring weather tools and basic human fatigue. Historians still argue whether mail order culture brought equality or simply new pressures to keep up. For many, it meant access to medical devices, school supplies, or even musical instruments. For others, it meant watching neighbors receive packages they could never afford. One farmer ordered a fiddle he couldn't play just to hear what hope sounded like. As you flip through a facsimile edition, you marvel at the juxtaposition medical syringes next to toy train sets, saddles beside evening gowns, rat poison beside cookbooks. It was chaos in print and utterly thrilling. The West may have lacked sidewalks, but it had window shopping, even if the windows were imaginary. You follow a mail carrier trudging up a dusty path with a sack of catalog orders. He's greeted like Santa Claus, even when all he brings is a roll of wallpaper and a pair of too small boots. The boots go to the youngest daughter. The wallpaper lines the inside of the outhouse, still a mark of taste. Some catalogs carried less visible weight. One included a coffin and embalming kit, complete with instructions. It was cheaper than hiring someone, and in many places there was no one to hire anyway. Life and death, one form postage paid. Later, you rest on a porch as two neighbors compare purchases. One shows off his new suspenders. The other holds up a squirrel trap he can't figure out. They laugh sip-tin mugs of chicory brew and dog-ear another page. You enter a shack that smells faintly of onions and desperation. In the corner, a man in a threadbare coat taps the side of a bottle filled with something brown and suspiciously bubbly. Cure-all, he says proudly, for coughs, burns, toothaches, and heartbreak. This is your first introduction to frontier medicine, where the local doctor might be a blacksmith with excellent handwriting. Medical care in the Wild West was an improvised affair equal parts hope and hearsay. Trained physicians were rare. Anyone with a box of tools and a knack for confidence could hang a shingle that read, "Doctor." Some had read half a textbook. Others just had strong opinions about garlic. You sit on a bench beside a boy with a sprained ankle. He's being treated with a poultice of mashed turnips and bacon fat. The doctor, who may also be the undertaker, says it's the latest Boston method. The boy winces. The doctor beams. You're not sure which is worse. Medical tools range from bone saws to butter knives. Anesthetic was often whiskey if you were lucky, or biting down on a leather strap if you weren't. Cleanliness was more aspirational than procedural. Surgeries took place on kitchen tables, sometimes beside the patient's lunch. Yet, somehow, people survived. They survived rattlesnake bites, childbirth, dysentery, and prairie fires with a mixture of home remedies, prayer, and sheer stubborn anatomy. A popular cold treatment involved raw onions placed in your socks overnight. Fever wrap yourself in hot towels and think cool thoughts. There is no scholarly consensus on how effective these treatments were. Some researchers believe the placebo effect worked over time in the West. Others argue the real miracle was distance diseases simply had fewer people to infect. You leaf through a worn medical journal left on a shelf. It includes advice like to relieve melancholy, walk briskly while reciting Bible verses, and gunshot wounds should be treated by removing the bullet if possible. If not, wait. These instructions are handwritten ink smeared by greasy fingers and hope. Women often filled medical gaps. You watch as a homesteader stitches her husband's leg after a plow accident, muttering that he should have listened when she warned him. Her surgery kit includes a darning needle and the same scissors she uses for quilting. He apologizes between clenched teeth. She ties off the final knot with a firm nod. One particularly infamous frontier doctor claimed to cure any ailment with a mix of vinegar, honey, and threats. He treated a broken wrist by re-breaking it more correctly. Patients both feared and respected him, mostly because they had no one else. At the town's edge, a shack displays a wooden sign, "Herbs and Bones, Remedies Within." You peek inside and find shelves lined with jars of dried plants, animal teeth, and a skull that might be decorative or might not. The woman inside hands you a satchel and says, "For headaches, dreams, or both." As the sun dips low, you hear coughing from a nearby porch, and the thud of boots as someone delivers another bottle of onion tonic, just in case. The cattle may have roamed, the men may have postured, but the women they adapted. You wander into a modest ranch where no husband lives, no father oversees, and no man holds the deed. The woman brushing dust off her boots isn't a widow in mourning. She's a rancher with a branding iron and a ledger book. On the frontier, not all women arrived as wives, and not all wanted to be. You pass a cluster of cabins inhabited by widows who pooled resources to raise children, tend gardens, and defend property. Without husbands, they carved out lives anyway, sometimes better ones. They made rules, traded favors, and understood that survival rarely waited for courtship. One woman you meet wears trousers under her apron. Her neighbors whisper she used to ride dispatch for the army dressed as a man. No one can confirm it, and no one dares ask. Her cattle are healthy. Her fences are straight. That's enough proof for most. You stop at a one-room schoolhouse where the teacher, Miss Margaret, is in her 30s, unmarried and entirely in charge. She boards with different families each month and earns her keep by educating every child in town, age 5 to 15. She also keeps a rifle beneath the chalkboard and has once or twice used it to scare off coyotes, not metaphorical ones. Some single women inherited land through obscure legal loopholes. Others filed homestead claims in their own names, rare but legal. A few disguised themselves as men for years, only revealing the truth once the title was safely theirs. Historians still debate how many of these cases exist. Surviving records are scarce. Gossip, however, is abundant. You meet one such homesteader, quiet, wiry, with hands like tree bark. She invites you in for stew and tells you how she learned to mend fences, shoe horses, and read weather signs just by watching. Her story comes in short bursts between sips of broth. Didn't have time to be afraid, she says. Too busy. In mining towns, some women ran businesses while men searched for gold. Laundry services, boarding houses, pie shops. These weren't side gigs. They were economic anchors. One woman in Colorado became so successful laundering miners' clothes that she bought the claim next to theirs and struck silver. She retired before 30. Local men still refer to her as ma'am, whether she's present or not. The social rules were elastic. Some women took on male-coded work without blinking. Others formed friendships that modern scholars interpret with cautious curiosity. Diaries speak of shared beds, shared chores, and affection that doesn't fit neatly into textbook categories. What it meant, no one can say for sure, but it kept people warm. Evenings often brought circles of single women gathering to patch clothes, share news, and swap solutions for everything from toothaches to stubborn goats. You sit beside one group as they sew and laugh, half gossip, half strategy meeting. The world outside might expect fragility, but inside this room, resilience wears petticoats and speaks bluntly. As dusk deepens, you pass a solitary figure, saddling a horse under a purple sky. Wide-brimmed hat, braided hair, steady hands. No one's daughter, no one's wife, just a life chosen and claimed. You follow the railroad tracks until they stop not in a city, not in a station, but in a ghost town where time once arrived and then quietly left. The silence is thick. A tumbleweed rolls through like it's checking in on old friends. Welcome to one of the many towns built entirely on a train schedule and erased by its absence. The town was born with the sound of hammers and steel. A railroad company announced a new depot, and within weeks tents turned into buildings. General stores, boarding houses, saloons all sprang up like mushrooms after rain. Land was bought, sold, and argued over before it was even surveyed. The train came once a day. That was enough to spark dreams of prosperity. You step into what was once the depot office. Dust blankets everything. A cracked ledger lists names of arrivals from places now forgotten. Some came to open businesses. Others came to escape old lives. One man wrote simply, "Needed change." Bought a hat. Train towns live by the timetable. Farmers planned harvest by it. Merchants timed their orders around it. Social life revolved around its whistle. If the train ran late, people waited. If it stopped coming entirely, people vanished. You wander past the collapsed remains of a hotel where the wallpaper still clings in, patches roses on yellowed paper. A cracked mirror reflects nothing but empty space. It feels like a place that held its breath and never exhaled. Historians still debate the ethics of railroad expansion. Some argue it brought progress. Others point to the hundreds of towns it abandoned their lifelines severed by new routes or budget cuts. For many, the train wasn't just a symbol of hope. It was their only link to medicine mail and the outside world. In this town, you find a rusted sign advertising hot pie and fast telegraphs. The telegraph poles still line the street like skeleton trees. You imagine the operator, once the most connected man in town, now just another name in a forgotten logbook. You meet an elderly woman tending a garden among the ruins. She stayed. Didn't see the point in chasing another town that might vanish too. Her father built the first saloon. Her brother died trying to fix the rail switch during a storm. It was loud here once, she says. Now it's just us and the birds. Not all train towns died slow deaths. Some disappeared overnight, rerouted tracks, failed negotiations, or rival towns offering better incentives. A depot 10 miles east could mean complete economic extinction. Townsfolk would wake up to find themselves cut off, marooned in prairie silence. You find an old timetable tacked to a wall, its final date faded. It reads like a love letter to movement arrival 9:32, departure 9:47, next stop, future. Except the future came without them. As you leave, the wind carries the faint echo of a whistle. Imagined or real, it doesn't matter. Somewhere down the line, another town is being born. This one, it dreams in rust. The air in this outpost smells sharp like creosote sun-baked metal, and something vaguely minty that might be medicinal or mildly poisonous. You duck beneath a wooden sign that reads, "Remedies and Curios," and step into a world of dusty bottles, hand-scrawled labels, and wildly optimistic promises. Welcome to the apothecary of the West, where snake oil wasn't just a phrase, it was a sales pitch. Shelves creak beneath jars of dried herbs, mystery powders and glass vials filled with liquids and shades nature never intended. The shopkeeper, a wiry man with impressive eyebrows and zero formal training, offers you a tonic good for digestion dreams and demons. You're not sure which ailment worries you more. Out here, pharmacy was a mix of folklore luck and whatever grew nearby. You pass a jar of prickly pear poultice used for burns and heartbreak, and a bundle of dried sage said to repel everything from colds to coyotes. Many of these cures worked sort of, others less so. One popular elixir claimed to cure baldness, rheumatism, and unwanted house guests. It was mostly molasses and cayenne. You meet a woman grinding herbs with a mortar carved from a buffalo bone. She inherited her knowledge from her mother, who learned it from a Comanche neighbor. Her remedies lean toward the natural yarrow for bleeding willow bark for fever, and a strong warning about never mixing licorice root with whiskey unless you enjoy hallucinating the weather. Some scholars remain divided on the effectiveness of these folk cures. Archaeological evidence suggests many did provide relief. Others argue they offered emotional comfort more than clinical results. Still on the frontier, belief often mattered as much as biology. You browse a back room labeled Serious Cases. It contains opium tincture chloroform and a shelf of tonics with alarming ingredients arsenic mercury, and something labeled calomel, which turns out to be toxic but fashionable in 1872. These were used sparingly, mostly when nothing else worked, or when the patient was especially irritating. Outside the shop, a traveling salesman sets up a small wooden stage. He wears a velvet coat, a top hat, and a grin you don't trust. He launches into a rapid-fire speech about his miracle serum made from rattlesnake venom, rose water, and a hint of moral courage. The crowd listens skeptical but hopeful. He finishes with a flourish and sells out in 10 minutes. You notice an old man muttering that it tastes like licorice and lies. In nearby towns, apothecaries often doubled as post offices, barber shops, or confession booths. People came for advice as often as they came for salves. You sit beside a teenager asking how to cure freckles. The apothecary prescribes lemon juice and optimism. Later, as twilight paints the sky in gold and rust, you see a child holding a bottle labeled sleep syrup tucked beneath her arm like a doll. Her mother reads the instructions carefully, then nods. Half a spoon, no more. The child nods back solemn as a priest. The wind shifts, and for a moment the air smells like peppermint regret, and the stubborn hope that maybe this bottle will be the one that works. The fence doesn't look like much, just twisted strands of wire strung between tired wooden posts, but it changed everything. You run your fingers along the rusted barbs and feel history prick back. This isn't just fencing, it's frontier control. And tonight you're standing on ground, once reshaped not by guns, but by barbed wire and the buffalo soldiers who guarded it. You walk alongside a soldier dressed in dark blue wool, his boots kicking up prairie dust. He's one of the men assigned to protect settlers, deliver mail, and keep peace in territories most people east of the Mississippi had never heard of. He's black proud and tired of being underestimated. The cavalry calls them Buffalo Soldiers, a name given by native tribes, possibly out of respect for their fierce fighting or their coarse dark hair. They did everything: built roads, escorted wagon trains, chased outlaws, and carried orders between remote posts. But their most powerful legacy might be the quiet patrols that ensured new fences stayed upright. As settlers stretched barbed wire across plains, conflicts with open-range ranchers and native tribes flared. These soldiers stood in between, often underpaid, always outnumbered, rarely thanked. Historians still debate whether barbed wire tamed the West or tore it apart. Some call it the death knell of the cowboy era. Once the fences went up, the wide-open drive was done. Others argue it brought safety and structure to a wild landscape. The truth, as usual, cuts both ways. You pass a ranch where wire runs in every direction, like veins through a body. It hums faintly in the wind. The owner, an aging woman with arms like braided rope, tells you how she strung most of it herself, one post hole at a time. Kept the cows in, and the neighbors honest. She jokes, squinting into the sun. Before barbed wire, cattle wandered freely. After it, every inch was claimed. Trespassing became theft. Fights broke out, some bureaucratic. You sit in on a frontier courtroom where one man insists the wind moved his fence. The judge sighs. The buffalo soldier beside him doesn't blink. These soldiers weren't just enforcers. They were often builders. You visit an abandoned fort where hand-laid bricks still carry the fingerprints of the men who stacked them. There's graffiti scratched into the barracks wall, a name, a date, and a crude drawing of a horse that looks suspiciously like a goat. It's funny, quiet rebellion proof that even disciplined lives need space to laugh. You follow the wire to a field where it ends abruptly tangled in tall grass. A rabbit hops over it with indifference. But to the people who once lived and fought here, this wire was everything, a symbol of order, a cause for conflict, a reminder that even invisible boundaries carry weight. As the wind picks up, you think about the stories that don't make it into history books. Not the shootouts or land rushes, but the slow, methodical fencing of a continent, and the soldiers who guarded lines drawn in dust. Somewhere nearby, a rusted cavalry bugle leans against a tree. No one's played it in decades. Still the fence hums on. The windmill turns slowly creaking like an old man's knees, each rotation pulling precious water from the invisible veins of the earth. You stand beside it, one hand on a rusted crank, listening to the quiet splash echoing from the pipe below. Out here, water isn't just a resource, it's a reason for war. And the battlefield is often someone's backyard. You glance across the prairie to a neighbor's land. It looks just like this one dry, golden and flat as a skillet. But one has a working well, and the other doesn't. That small difference is enough to spark arguments, lawsuits, and the occasional mysterious disappearance of livestock. Windmills were miraculous in a very loud and wobbly kind of way. First patented in the mid-1800s, they brought water within reach for thousands of homesteaders. One spinning wheel could draw gallons per hour, just enough to fill troughs, water crops, or take a bath if you felt lucky and reckless. You enter a cabin where a family's entire routine revolves around the windmill's creaks. Breakfast waits until the tank fills. Laundry waits until the breeze blows. Showers. Those happen when the wind is strong and the mood is cooperative. The kids joke that their bathtub depends on the weather report. But the problem wasn't the windmill. It was what happened when neighbors got jealous. You walk past a half-built fence abandoned after a dispute over a puddle. Yes, a puddle. One man claimed runoff from a windmill crossed onto his land and caused erosion. The other claimed divine rights to gravity. Neither side won. The puddle dried up. Historians still debate whether frontier water wars were exaggerated in later stories, or if they were truly that petty. Surviving court records suggest both. One legal battle over a diverted stream lasted 7 years and ended with someone damming the creek out of spite. You meet a teenage girl who proudly maintains her family's windmill. She climbs the rickety ladder with ease, grease rag in one pocket wrench in the other. Dad says, "This is our real treasure," she tells you. "The gold's in the well." Her siblings nod like it's gospel. In some towns, entire economies formed around communal wells guarded like banks. You step into a general store that sells windmill parts next to licorice whips. A sign warns no refunds on buckets or disputes. A local joke, probably, except no one's smiling. When wells dried up, people moved. When they didn't, people fought. You pass a gravestone with a single word, water. Maybe it's a name. Maybe it's a cause of death. Some scholars argue that windmills mark the beginning of the end for truly wild frontiers. Once water could be summoned with a breeze, the land became less lawless and more worth claiming. Others suggest the opposite, that every improvement just raised the stakes. As night falls, the wind picks up. The blades begin to spin faster, whining into the darkness. You lean against the tower and feel the rhythm of it, steady, necessary, stubborn. A few feet away, A metal bucket overflows. No one notices. For once, there's more than enough. It's just a chore, fetching water, chopping wood, gathering eggs. Harmless, ordinary, boring. But on the frontier, even the mundane could turn murderous. You step into a morning that smells like sweat pine resin and singed cornbread, and follow a child no older than 8 as he grabs a tin pail and heads for the creek. The sun is up. The wolves are hopefully not. The path to the water looks peaceful, lined with golden grass and dragonflies, but your gut tightens. Too many stories start this way, simple errands that ended with snake bites, twisted ankles, or sudden storms. The boy walks fast. He knows the danger lies not in any single threat, but in the combination distance timing luck. Chores were constant. Hauling wood took hours. Churning butter meant sore arms and splinters. Even gathering eggs had risks. Hens could be aggressive snakes, liked warm nests, and falling through a rotted barn plank could leave you hobbling for days. You pass a girl struggling to start a fire in the wind. Her hands are blistered from yesterday's failed attempt, but she keeps at it. The fire's needed to boil water, which will clean the laundry which must be done today because tomorrow they're butchering a pig and after that hauling salt. Rest is something the preacher talks about, but never on laundry day. Inside one cabin, you meet a boy recovering from a broken leg. He slipped while splitting wood and spent 2 hours crawling back home. His sister had to walk to the neighbor's place 6 miles to borrow crutches and soup. The parents were away trading pelts. No doctor visited. The leg healed, mostly. Historians still debate how many frontier deaths were technically accidents and how many were avoidable with better tools or help. Records are vague. People rarely wrote down how someone died gathering firewood. You find a diary from a woman who wrote, "Today I boiled my hand. My fault. No elaboration. Just a quiet acknowledgement of pain, jotted between bread recipes and notes about the weather. Even routine chores had time limits. Water had to be fetched before sundown, firewood split before frost, chickens fed before coyotes prowled. Delay one task and the rest unraveled. And yet, people kept doing them over and over season after season. Not because they liked it, because if they didn't, the consequences came swiftly. You watch a teenage boy checking snares for rabbits moving with silent precision. He's barefoot. He always is. Boots are for town trips and winter funerals. One foot steps near a cactus. He swears softly but doesn't stop. There's no backup. If he fails dinner, is wild onions and regret. Even leisure had consequences. A child swinging from a barn rope once snapped the beam and broke her arm. She recovered, but the barn leaned ever after. No more fun, her father declared. The rope still hangs frayed and symbolic. As the sun dips low and chores begin again, in reverse shutting doors, banking fires, double-checking latches, you realize survival didn't hinge on grand battles. It hung threadbare on the simple things not going terribly wrong. You'd expect outlaws to be thrilling bandits on horseback eyes, squinting beneath wide-brimmed hats, wanted posters fluttering dramatically in the wind. But you sit across from a man whose crime spree involved ledgers, mismatched receipts, and the least exciting word in the English language embezzlement. Welcome to the unremarkable truth of many bad men of the West. He's chewing on a pencil and reviewing invoices. Occasionally he mutters about misfile livestock reports. His alias Red Dan sounds menacing until you realize it's because of a sunburn he never quite recovered from. His most daring heist, redirecting payroll funds from a mining company to his personal account in a Denver bank. No gunfire, no getaway horse, just paperwork. Turns out many Western criminals weren't outlaws by legend, they were outlaws by accountancy. You flip through records of cattle fraud, land deed forgeries, and suspicious railroad subsidies. Some crimes were creative. Most were mind-numbingly dull. You walk past a jail cell containing a man accused of stealing fence posts. He admits it, but insists he was merely borrowing them indefinitely. Another inmate allegedly overcharged settlers for wagon repairs by claiming fictional taxes. His cellmate rolls his eyes and calls him the bandit of bureaucracy. Historians remain divided on why the Wild West became such fertile ground for petty crime. Some argue it was the lack of oversight. Others point to the slow legal systems and frontier trust culture where a good handshake sometimes replaced formal contracts. Whatever the reason, crime often looked less like wanted dead or alive and more like, oops, I lost the receipts. You browse through a court transcript where a saloon owner sued a rival for stealing his beer recipe. The accused responded by claiming he was merely improving it. The judge's final ruling included the phrase, not legally theft, if it tastes better, which has since been removed from official precedent. Even the infamous figures had quieter sides. Billy the Kid once spent 2 weeks hiding in a church attic, passing time by carving chess pieces from soap. Jesse James reportedly preferred gardening to gambling. Some records suggest he planted lavender along his fence. You sit in on a town meeting where the sheriff lists this month's offenses: 2 goats stolen, 1 fence sabotaged, and a pie contest sabotaged by mysterious oversalting. The townsfolk nod gravely. Justice must prevail. A boy in the back snickers. He's holding a salt shaker. Some criminals leaned into their reputations. One man nicknamed himself the Phantom Accountant. He wore a cape and stole only during eclipses. He was caught on his 3rd outing. His disguise was a fake mustache drawn in charcoal. No one believed him to be particularly dangerous, just very committed to the bit. By evening, you watch a shopkeeper lock up his register with a key tied to his belt. He nods at you, says we've had 4 robberies in 15 years. All of them involve receipts. He shakes his head. Even the bandits are boring now. Somewhere down the street, a wanted poster flutters in the wind. The crime forgery of a chicken license, the bounty $2, and a slice of pie. The barn smells of hay boot polish and anticipation. You slip inside just as someone strikes the first fiddle note sharp and sweet. A ring of lanterns casts golden halos on dusty rafters, and boots shuffle eagerly on the packed earth floor. This isn't a showdown or a saloon brawl. It's a Saturday night social where the most dangerous move is stepping on a barefoot toe during the Virginia reel. In a frontier world defined by chores, hunger, and long silences, these gatherings were sacred. You scan the crowd, every age, every status. A farmer in patched suspenders tries not to sweat through his only good shirt. A widow straightens her kerchief and practices smiling. Children spin like weather vanes between the adults half-hyped on molasses taffy and the thrill of staying up past dark. Tonight's music is provided by a 3-man band, 1 fiddle, 1 banjo, 1 man beating a wooden crate like it owes him money. They're slightly out of tune, but no one minds. Rhythm, not perfection, is the point. You join the edge of a circle where partners bow twirl and occasionally bump into each other with delighted apologies. One woman dances with a baby in her arms. A boy attempts a fancy heel kick, promptly trips and bows theatrically from the floor. Applause follows. He grins victorious. These dances weren't just entertainment, they were community maintenance. You meet a young couple who first held hands during a reel and now run a hog farm together. Another woman tells you she's danced with the same 3 men for a decade, none of them her husband, all of them reliable footsteppers. Historians still argue whether frontier socials were more about courtship or survival. Some say it was marriage marketing. Others believe the real goal was simple: to remember how to laugh when the fields failed and the storms got mean. You grab a mug of something warm, probably cider, possibly suspicious, and sit near a group of elders trading stories and quiet jokes. One man insists he once danced so hard he cracked a floorboard. The others nod politely. You notice the crack. Maybe it's true. Outside the barn, a row of horses snort and shuffle, tied up and disinterested. One child tries to braid a pony's mane while humming along. Her mother calls her back inside, just as a square dance begins. The caller's voice rises above the music. Bow to your partner, swing and spin. And just like that, the room becomes a galaxy of boots and skirts and flying elbows. No one here is worried about appearances. A woman with one stocking dances beside a man with two left boots. Laughter swells when a couple forgets the steps and invents their own. It's the kind of chaos that feels safe. By the end of the night, the fiddle strings are frayed, the cider barrel is dry, and someone's left a single boot behind. You step outside into the cool air and hear echoes of clapping and laughter roll across the prairie like a soft drum beat. Tomorrow, the chores return, but for now, the dance lingers. You hear them before you see them, hooves drumming like distant thunder across the plains. Dust rises in thick plumes, and from the horizon emerges a moving wave of muscle horn and confusion. The cattle drive is here, and if you were expecting glamour, saddle up for disappointment, because behind every romantic tale of the open trail is a reality filled with mud mooing and mild existential regret. You ride alongside a drover whose hat is more patch than fabric, his mustache holding on to breakfast crumbs with quiet dignity. He hasn't slept properly in 4 days and hasn't bathed in longer. The cows don't mind. He shrugs. He says this as one particularly judgmental-looking steer side-eyes both of you. Cattle drives were brutal. Long hours, dangerous terrain, and constant noise. Drives could last months, cover hundreds of miles, and required constant vigilance to keep the herd together. You see riders circling the edges like sheepdogs on horseback, yelling, whistling occasionally, cursing, but never shooting. Gunfire spooked the herd. That's how stampedes happened. The cowboys slept on the ground, ate beans from dented tins, and rotated night watch duties like reluctant insomniacs. Their biggest enemy, boredom, followed closely by weather. Lightning storms could scatter cattle for miles. Flash floods drowned calves and soaked supplies. Dust storms turned eyes into sandpaper. Historians continue to debate whether cattle drives were more economically necessary or culturally constructed. Some argue they were vital to meat distribution. Others say they were as much about establishing American myth as moving livestock. The truth likely lies somewhere between hunger and storytelling. You watch as one cowboy sings to the herd. Soft, low tunes meant to calm nervous animals. This cowboy lullaby tradition wasn't just folklore, it worked. The cows seemed to settle, lulled by sound, into temporary cooperation. It's oddly touching, like watching a grizzled man read poetry to a rock. But it wasn't all poetry. Disagreements over direction, stolen cattle, or missing supplies could lead to fights, not shootouts, but grumpy arguments over map reading and whose turn it was to check the southern flank. You witness one such spat end with the words, "Fine, let the cows decide." They mooed ambiguously. You visit the chuck wagon hub of the entire operation. The cook called Cookie, despite his obvious disdain for the nickname, rules the supplies with tyrannical love. He feeds the crew, manages rations, and occasionally mediates disputes with a ladle. His beans are legendary. His temper is biblical. Drives ended in stockyards, rail depots, or small towns where exhausted cowboys traded stories and sore muscles for whiskey and sleep. Some never made it back to the trail. Others returned every season, unable to resist the strange rhythm of dust and hooves. You follow the final herd into a holding pen as the sun sets, casting long shadows over tired horses and triumphant cowhands. One leans against a fence post and mutters, "We only lost 12. No one asks if he means cow's boots or sanity. The last steer stumbles in eyes wide, chewing something unidentifiable. The drive is over. For now, the dust settles, but your senses still hum with the trail's residue beans, leather brine, and soot. Your mind drifts not to the cowboys themselves, but to what sustained them. The meals, the monotony, the rituals of survival. You're crouched beside a fire, its heat licking the side of your face as you watch a metal pot bubble over with something that smells like salt and smoke. On the American frontier, dinner was rarely a surprise. Day after day, families survived on a trinity of staples: beans, biscuits, and barrel pork. These three ingredients stashed in wooden crates or preserved in brine were the backbone of survival. They didn't taste great, but they lasted. The beans were usually dried navy or pinto, easy to store, and rich enough in calories to pass for a proper meal. They needed hours to soak and boil longer still if the firewood was wet, which it often was. But once softened, a bit of pork fat or molasses could turn them into something almost edible. And then there were the biscuits hardtack, actually, a kind of flour and water cracker baked until all joy was removed. They lasted forever, which is another way of saying they were indigestible. Most folks dip them in coffee or stew just to soften them enough to bite. Children sometimes use them as teething toys. Some scholars remain amused by reports that early dentists kept bits of broken biscuit in their display jars, proof that a bad bake could outlast a good tooth. Pork came packed in barrels of salt brine, not fresh, not tender, and certainly not lean. This was salt pork, fatty preserved slabs of meat that had to be boiled repeatedly just to become chewable. The smell was legendary. One traveler described it as eating a shoe cured in seawater. Still, a chunk of pork could flavor an entire pot of beans, stretching its use for weeks. Some historians argue that this monotonous diet was more than necessity, it was strategy. A predictable low-maintenance pantry meant more time for survival, for chopping wood, tending animals, or simply not freezing to death. And yet, there's a strange comfort in the repetition. The scratch of biscuit crust, the oily sheen of pork fat skimming a stew, the thud of a wooden spoon in a cast-iron pot. Dinner wasn't just food, it was the rhythm of survival. There's something quietly absurd about a pie made of onions and squirrel. But on the American frontier, creativity was often born from desperation, and dinner looked like whatever twitched, clucked, sprouted, or scurried nearby. The frontier kitchen wasn't stocked with choice, it was stocked with chance. You squat low beside the cook fire again, this time watching a small gray tail poke out of a pot. Squirrel stew. Not a delicacy, just a default. It sizzles with a strange gamey aroma, softened by the scent of wild onions and thickened with flour scraped from the bottom of a sack. Pioneer families didn't waste. They adapted. And adapt they did, especially with ingredients that might make a modern palate flinch. Pioneer pies weren't always sweet, and they certainly weren't made with store-bought crusts. Instead, imagine a rough lard-based dough, folded around whatever could be chopped, diced, or caught. Onions and potatoes, yes, but also blackbirds, squirrels, and on rare occasions even muskrat. Some versions used a crust only on the top, stretched just thin enough to bake golden and trap steam. One surviving recipe from a settler's diary describes rabbit and greens, pie baked until stiff and served cold. Another recalls a custard made from mashed pumpkin and milked acorns, both slightly bitter but surprisingly filling. Historians still argue whether such dishes were treats or merely tolerable. Some even suggest the lines between dessert and dinner blurred entirely when supplies ran low. Then there was the squirrel stew. Trappers favored it. Farmers tolerated it. Children named the bones. If you could get past the initial shock and the fur, it was protein. Stewed long enough with garden scraps or leftover salt pork. It became the base for something hearty, if not exactly beloved. And let's not forget slump or cobbler, which could swing sweet or savory, depending on what was tossed in. Apples great, turnips. Also fine, berries if you were lucky. Dried fruit rehydrated in coffee if not. Some cooks mixed flour with water, wrapped it in cloth, and boiled it in the same stew pot, emerging with a sort of dumpling that resembled pudding, tasted like linen, and filled the belly with stubborn optimism. There's no scholarly consensus on whether pioneer children liked these meals or simply learned not to complain. What we do know is that mothers passed down tricks to stretch a single chicken across 5 mouths, or to disguise the toughness of wild meat with vinegar, molasses, or patience. You imagine reaching for a slice of this so-called pie, its crust flaking unevenly under your thumb, the steam rising to meet your face with a smell somewhere between soup and survival. Not indulgent, not even comforting, just real, just earned. The frontier menu may not have pleased the palate, but it fed the will. With every strange stew or makeshift tart families stitched together, another evening of endurance served hot cold, or whatever temperature the fire allowed. From beneath the ash and ember, something magical emerges, flat, smoky, and barely holding together. Not quite bread, not quite pancake. It's an ash cake, and you flip it with a stick, hoping it doesn't crumble. The frontier kitchen wasn't a kitchen at all. It was a patch of dirt beside the fire, and the tools of the trade were whatever didn't catch fire. Dutch ovens were the crown jewels of the American frontier. Heavy soot-streaked and endlessly versatile, these cast-iron pots sat directly in the coals' lids heaped with embers to mimic the even heat of an oven. You could bake a loaf of bread stew, a rabbit, or roast a handful of apples if you had them. The design dates back centuries, but frontier folk turned it into an art form. One oven, a good fire, and enough time could feed a family or a camp. But for many, even that was a luxury. More often, food was cooked directly on the coals or buried in ash to slow roast with hope and guesswork. Ash cakes made from cornmeal water and salt were shaped by hand and tucked under the embers. You brushed them off with your sleeve and hoped the grit was only from the corn. Some pioneers swore the ash improved the flavor. Others, mostly children, disagreed with their teeth. There's a quirky footnote in culinary history about hoe cakes named for the flat-bladed tool often used as a griddle. Farmers would clean the blade pile on the batter and rest it at the fire's edge. Whether it was actually clean is still debated. Some scholars point out that the origin of the name might be more metaphorical than practical, but the visual of bread sizzling on garden tools remains oddly charming. Biscuits, pancakes, flapjacks, call them what you like. But on the frontier, they were all born of the same parent cornmeal. Wheat flour was scarce and expensive, but corn was hardy, abundant, and could survive brutal seasons. Some communities ground it coarsely for grits, others fine for mush or cakes. Fried in bacon fat or dropped into boiling broth cornmeal became the canvas of the frontier table. And when flour was around, fry bread, often made by indigenous families and later adopted by settlers, emerged as another staple. It puffed up golden and chewy, sometimes dusted with sugar or stuffed with beans. Its origins, rooted in both tradition and tragedy, are still felt today. Historians continue to debate how much settler influence blended with native recipes, and how much was simply born of need. You picture a mother squatting beside the fire, flipping cakes on an iron skillet balanced on rocks, the smell of scorched corn and bacon in the air. A child waits hungry, but quiet, already knowing this meal tastes like every meal and still wanting more. Dutch ovens and ash cakes weren't just cooking methods. They were survival tools built for the long game, baked with care and eaten with gratitude, or at least acceptance. Some things were stronger than the frontier's walls, fiercer than its winters, and more vital than its meat. Chief among them, coffee. It wasn't just a drink, it was a lifeline, brewed dark and bitter, consumed with reverence. Out here, a good cup of coffee was more sacred than sleep, and often harder to find. You're crouched again, steam rising from a tin cup clutched in your hands. The aroma is sharp, smoky, almost metallic, less of a flavor and more of an experience. Frontier coffee wasn't about taste. It was about staying alert, warmed from within, and tethered to routine in a life where routine was rare. Coffee beans were precious, sometimes more valuable than tobacco or sugar. Families stored them like treasure hidden away in cloth sacks or sealed jars. Roasting was done over open flames, often unevenly. The result: a blend of scorched, under-roasted, and just right beans crushed by hand with a rock or a rolling pin. It was gritty. It was burnt. It was somehow perfect. But when the beans ran out, which they often did, people got inventive. There were dozens of substitutes, none of them pleasant. Roasted acorns, chicory roots, parched corn, even scorched bread crusts made their way into kettles. The goal wasn't to mimic flavor, it was to mimic ritual. The color, the steam, the act of sipping something hot while the wind howled against the cabin walls. Some old-timers even brewed what they called campfire coffee toss grounds directly into the boiling water, let it foam settle, and then pour slowly to avoid drinking mud. A horseshoe was sometimes used as a test. If it didn't sink in the pot, the brew was strong enough. Or maybe too strong. There's no scholarly consensus on how widespread these methods were. Some journals describe elaborate setups with imported grinders and enamel percolators, while others suggest a scorched pot and a stick for stirring was more the norm. Frontier life wasn't uniform. It was adaptable, a quirky detail. Children were often given their own version coffee milk, a splash of real brew mixed with scalded milk and molasses. It was sweet thin and utterly pointless, but it made the children feel grown up. Some say it was how the addiction started early. You take another pretend sip. Maybe it's real coffee. Maybe it's dandelion roots and false hope. But the ritual is calming. Something about the warmth, the smell, the weight of the mug, it anchors you. It belongs to the hands of someone determined to make comfort out of scarcity. Historians still debate whether coffee on the frontier was more about energy or habit. Maybe both. Maybe it was the last piece of civility clung to in a world of ash cakes and squirrel stew. Either way, it was strong, stronger than the bread, stronger than the salt pork, and definitely stronger than the friendships it sometimes brewed, since the last cup was always up for quiet, passive-aggressive grabs. You bite down and immediately regret it. The bread doesn't give, your teeth do. It's tough, dense, dry. A frontier loaf could double as a building material or a self-defense weapon, depending on how long it had been sitting out. But you chew anyway because bread was bread, and it didn't grow on trees. Frontier bread was rarely soft or fluffy. Most loaves were made from coarse flour, sometimes mixed with cornmeal rye or even ground peas. Without commercial yeast or refined wheat, the dough rose only when coaxed by sourdough starters or wild fermentation. And if your starter failed, so did your bread. The result? Dense bricks baked in iron pans over uneven fires. Some families called it journey bread because it lasted through the journey and possibly longer. In many households, molasses became the unsung hero of the breadbasket. A sticky dark syrup poured over cracked crusts or soaked into stale slices. It didn't improve texture, but it made swallowing easier. Children learned early to smear molasses over everything. Bread, corn cakes, even salt pork. The flavor helped. The sugar helped more. A quirky frontier recipe describes bread soaked in hot water, mashed with a spoon, and stirred with lard and molasses until it became a pudding. Eaten with a ladle, not a fork. Not because it was delicious, but because it was chewable. Historians continue to debate just how nutritionally valuable these tough breads were. Some argue they were packed with calories and fiber. Others suggest the grinding stones often left tiny bits of grit in the flour, wearing down teeth faster than sugar ever could. By middle age, many settlers had mouths full of gaps or creative prosthetics carved from animal bone. Still bread meant stability. It could be made in batches dried for travel or traded for better things. A traveler arriving with fresh loaves was treated like royalty. A good starter culture shared between neighbors could bind a community together more tightly than a barn raising. One account from a Swedish immigrant in the Midwest recalls a neighbor gifting her a piece of dried dough wrapped in muslin. For your bread and your home. It was a sourdough start and a symbol of welcome. Even failures had value. Burnt bread could be crumbled into stew. Flatbread could be folded around bacon. Crumbs could be saved for battering fish if fish were ever caught. Nothing was wasted. Even when the bread went hard as stone, it found a second life in frying pans or feed bags. You can picture it now, a mother at dawn, kneading in silence, hands red from cold eyes focused on the dough that might or might not rise. A child watching knowing this loaf might be their only one for days. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't golden, but it was bread. And on the frontier that counted for everything. You step outside into the wind and the world is suddenly green but not lush. Scrappy green, tactical green. The kind of growth that clings to survival. Around the cabin, patches of corn stand crooked. Near the creek, wild greens with names you've never heard of ripple like secrets in the breeze. This isn't a garden, it's a quiet rebellion against starvation. Frontier women, often the keepers of the soil, became masters of coaxing life from uncooperative earth. With rocky soil, unpredictable rain, and the ever-present threat of frost or raiders, they had to plant not just for nourishment, but for strategy. Corn was the reigning monarch of the garden, prized for its triple threat, eaten fresh dried, for flour, or fed to animals. Grown tall and dense, it also doubled as a windbreak or privacy fence. But beyond the corn rows, something more eclectic flourished. Dandelion purslane lamb's quarters, so-called weeds in modern terms, were welcome guests in frontier plots. Packed with nutrients, these wild greens were gathered into baskets and cooked down into bitter iron-rich mush. Children called it green porridge, often begrudgingly. Adults ate it because it worked. Some families cultivated cattails, especially near marshy edges. The young shoots were peeled like asparagus boiled, until tender, and served with salt when there was salt to spare. The roots were ground into flour. The pollen made a yellow dust that looked like gold and acted like starch. Historians still argue how widely cattails were cultivated versus foraged, but in the right hands the plant was a full-course meal. A quirky trick passed down in diaries grow onions between the rows of corn. It discouraged pests and masked the scent of other crops. The combination made for hearty stews and possibly fewer insect intrusions during mealtime. And then there were medicinal plants, yarrow for bleeding, chamomile for sleep, peppermint for digestion. Women knew them by sight, smell, and season. Not every leaf was dinner, but every leaf had a job. Of course, gardening was perilous. Deer drought or an unexpected hailstorm could erase a month's labor in minutes. Some gardens were dug into hillsides or hidden behind brush to avoid detection from roaming bandits or enemy scouts. Survival wasn't just about planting, it was about hiding what grew. Researchers continue to debate whether frontier gardens were truly planned or simply clusters of opportunism seeds scattered where the sun lingered, where the goats didn't trample. But the results fed families flavored pots and taught generations how to grow resilience. You imagine a woman crouched low, pressing a seed into hard soil, with her thumb whispering a promise to it. She doesn't know if it'll grow, she just knows it has to. These gardens weren't pretty, they weren't symmetrical, but they worked. Wild greens and rogue vegetables made meals more than just survival. They added color, texture, and hope to the plate. And when things went quiet, when raiders loomed or the land turned cruel, those same plants became something else entirely: insurance. But that's a story for next time. The cupboard is almost empty. The garden's been trampled. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks, but no one goes to check. This is what it feels like when your food has been taken not by nature or neglect, but by human hands. Raids, blockades, and theft weren't just fears, they were regular features of frontier life. And when supplies vanished, rationing wasn't a choice. It was a quiet, exhausting ritual. You picture a family gathered around a table, one pot in the center, no plates. Each person with a spoon and a practiced sense of portion control. Parents went last, or sometimes didn't eat at all. Children learned early what hunger meant and how to stretch a bowl of mush to last just one more night. During times of conflict, skirmishes with enemy militias, clashes with raiders, or even internal feuds, entire settlements could lose access to their stored food. Smokehouses were burned, root cellars, looted fields, destroyed. In these moments, the real inventory began: counting dried beans one by one, weighing flour by the handful, measuring lard with a spoon and a prayer. There's a documented case from a frontier fort in Kentucky where rations dwindled to 3 ounces of cornmeal per person per day. Mixed with water and fried into cakes, it became both breakfast and dinner. No lunch, no snacks. Historians still debate whether such accounts were exaggerated for effect, or if the human body simply adapted to prolonged scarcity. Quirky substitutes appeared during these lean periods. Pine bark was peeled and boiled into broth. Leather scraps, especially old belts, were softened in water and chewed like jerky. Some pioneers even steeped hay to make a weak tea that smelled faintly of meadows and desperation. And still they rationed. Food was hidden in floorboards, buried in jars tucked into hollowed fence posts. Recipes shrank from cups to pinches. A biscuit recipe might read, "add flour until it's no longer runny." Measurements became gestures. Meals became math problems. Salt especially became a precious commodity during raids. Without it, meat-spoiled bread lost its flavor, and wounds festered. Women traded jewelry or heirlooms for a single pouch of it, sometimes even bartered promises they couldn't keep. There's a soft sorrow in these stories. The way mothers watered down stew to create more bowls. The way children came to love broth because it was warm, not because it was filling. The way a single carrot split 5 ways could still feel generous. And yet, families survived. They rationed quietly without panic. They played games to distract hungry minds. They told stories to pass the time between mouthfuls. And when the danger passed, they restocked relentlessly. You imagine hiding the last onion in a basket of laundry, the fear of being found, the hope of using it for Sunday stew. These were the choices people made not out of panic, but out of practice. Rationing wasn't just about food, it was about resilience. And on the frontier, that might have been the most nourishing thing of all. The door creaks open, and a stranger steps inside with a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside, tea leaves, cinnamon, maybe a sliver of ginger root. It's not treasure in the usual sense, but on the American frontier, this was luxury incarnate: aromas that could lift spirits' warm bones and turn a cabin into something resembling a home. Even in the remotest log shelters, the desire for flavor never vanished. Spices and teas, though exotic and rare, managed to trickle westward through trading posts, traveling peddlers, or the dusty saddlebags of passing merchants. They were never abundant, but they were enough. Most of the time, these goods arrived through barter: a raccoon pelt for a fistful of cinnamon, dried venison traded for 2 ounces of black tea. Occasionally, a missionary or soldier would return from the east carrying loose leaves or mysterious powders, offering the kind of taste no cornmeal could replicate. Cinnamon was prized not just for its sweetness, but its versatility. Stirred into porridge, it masked the blandness. Sprinkled over ash cakes, it felt festive. A pinch was often saved for birthdays, weddings, or holidays, even if there was no cake to go with it. There's an entry in one settler's journal that reads simply, "Used last of cinnamon. House smells like hope." Black tea, meanwhile, had a complicated journey. Some families boiled pine needles or local herbs and called it tea, but true leaves, usually over-dried and crumbling, were special occasion fare. Steeped once, then twice, then again. Waste was unthinkable. The final brew might be as pale as dishwater, but still sipped like royalty. Scholars remain divided over how common these spices were in isolated areas. Some argue that flavor was sacrificed early on, while others point to trade routes like the Santa Fe Trail or the Great Lakes fur circuits that funneled small but precious quantities deep into the wild. And then there were the spice blends, savory mixes of salt, pepper, dried onion, and mustard seed, passed down in stained cloth pouches. No labels, no measurements. Just taste adjusted by instinct. One frontier wife reportedly named her mixture witch salt for its uncanny ability to fix bland meat. Another insisted that cloves made everything feel warmer, even cold beans. Quirky detail. Some cabins hung cinnamon sticks from rafters, not just for cooking, but to mask the smell of drying hides. Others tucked bay leaves between bedding to repel pests, repurposing kitchen supplies into rustic home defense. You imagine sharing a cup of spiced tea by firelight, the air thick with wood smoke, and faint sweetness, the cup warm in your hands even if the cabin walls let the cold in. It doesn't matter what the tea's made of, it matters that it exists. These rare ingredients weren't just about flavor, they were about memory culture, and the stubborn refusal to let go of comfort. A pinch of spice wasn't frivolous, it was a declaration. Because even in a world of squirrel stew and tough bread, people craved beauty. And sometimes it came in the form of a single dried leaf. The forest is still too still. You bend down, fingers brushing past a patch of unfamiliar leaves. Are they edible, medicinal, poisonous? On the frontier, foraging was both art and gamble, guided as much by stories as by science. People ate what they could, but also what they'd only heard was safe. Sometimes they got lucky. Sometimes they didn't. Foraging wasn't a casual hobby. It was survival dressed up in folklore. Families scouted fields, riverbanks, and shaded groves for roots, berries, tubers, and herbs. Some plants like wild onions, hickory nuts, or fiddleheads were well-known staples. Others were wrapped in rumor and half-remembered instructions passed down over fireside whispers. Frontier children grew up reciting rules like spells read on the vine, leave it behind, white roots in pairs, say your prayers, the problem. Those rules weren't always accurate. Surviving records offer conflicting accounts of what was actually safe to eat. One settler's healing root turned out to be another's laxative disaster. Pokeweed, for instance, was both feared and revered. Cook it wrong, and you'd fall ill. Boil it 3 times and add vinegar, and it became a spring delicacy. Sassafras made flavorful tea, but was rumored to summon strange dreams. Milkweed had edible shoots, but only if you knew the right window of harvest and the right boiling method. A quirky favorite, the Jerusalem artichoke, also called sunroot. A knobby tuber that looked like ginger and grew like a weed, it could be roasted, mashed, or fried. Settlers called it the potato's confused cousin. Some even believed it improved eyesight or made your dreams sweeter. Science says otherwise, but the hope was real. Herbal lore filled the gaps in formal knowledge. Yarrow for fevers, plantain for stings, boneset for everything from colds to heartbreak. If you couldn't name a plant, you described it the one that smells like mint, but bites like pepper. These descriptors were colorful, sometimes poetic, and not always helpful. The line between medicine and food blurred constantly. A sprig in stew for flavor, a poultice for a twisted ankle, a tea brewed just in case. Some remedies worked, others did nothing, or worse. Still people believed, and belief in those lean times sometimes carried more weight than certainty. Scholars continue to debate the effectiveness of frontier foraging practices. Were they truly based on indigenous wisdom and empirical learning, or were many just lucky guesses dressed up in confidence? Probably both. The truth was often lost in the brush. You walk through the imagined woods now, watching a woman pause beside a patch of green. She kneels, she hesitates. Then she plucks one leaf, presses it between her fingers, and nods. She knows this one, or thinks she does. Foraging wasn't just about plants. It was about memory, stories embedded in soil, traditions whispered by women to daughters who whispered them again until the forest spoke a language only the desperate could hear. Food lore wrapped the unknown in comfort. And when your garden failed or the salt pork spoiled, you went into the woods, not for a meal, but for a maybe. The stars are high, the fire's low, and someone's just flipped a steak, if you can call it that. Out here on the cattle trail, cookout meant one thing: feed the cowboys fast and make it hot enough to kill whatever was crawling on it. There were no tables, no napkins, and definitely no forks. Just meat, grease, beans, and the eternal hope for coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Cowboy cookouts were rough and rapid affairs. After a long day of herding cattle across dust-choked plains, trail hands would dismount, tend the fire, and eat whatever didn't walk off first. Chuck wagon cooks, affectionately called, Cookie, were in charge of feeding a dozen hungry, exhausted men, using one pan, a few knives, and a dented coffee pot. Their tools were basic. Their meals were memorable, not always in a good way. Main courses were usually beef tough cuts from the drive, fried in their own fat, or stewed with onions and dried chilies if someone remembered to bring them. Beans were ever present, cooked slowly over the coals and stirred with a stick. If there was stale bacon or salt pork, left it went in too, making the pot a swirling cauldron of smoke, grit, and hope. Cornbread sometimes made an appearance, often cooked in the same pan right after the meat. Grease wasn't wiped off, it was considered seasoning. Some trail hands joked that the food came pre-digested from sheer overcooking. One diary mentions jerky so dry, I mistook it for my bootlace. There's still debate among historians about just how uniform these cookouts were. Some describe surprisingly elaborate setups with folding tables and spice racks. Others claim meals were eaten from knives while standing in dust, with fingers so blackened by soot, no one dared ask what else they'd touched. Quirky detail. Many cowboys swore by son of a gun stew, a mystery meat dish that sometimes included awful marrow bones or even tongue. You didn't ask what was in it, you just chewed and hoped. There's a legendary version that included calf brains and sweetbreads served proudly by trail cooks, with a wink and no explanation. And of course, there were the beans. Trail beans, pinto beans, red beans, names didn't matter. They were filling cheap and could be soaked during the ride and cooked upon arrival. Cowboys added molasses coffee or old bacon grease to deepen the flavor, or just to make them different from yesterday's pot. Some ranchers brought along pickled goods, onions, eggs, or even beets in jars that somehow survived the jostling trail. Others considered those too fancy, preferring a raw onion and hardtack slapped together like a sandwich. Nobody ate for pleasure, they ate for fuel. You picture the cook squatting by the flames, turning a chunk of meat with a hunting knife, swatting flies with the same hand. He's humming, maybe cursing. The men gather bowls outstretched, grateful not for the food itself, but for the fire, the warmth, the moment of stillness. This wasn't dinner. It was routine ritual and reward, all scorched into the same blackened pan. The kettle whistles, but it's not tea. It's pressure panic and the unmistakable scent of boiling pears. You're in a cabin kitchen, hands trembling as you lift the lid from a tin jar. Will it seal? Will it spoil? Or worse, will it explode? Welcome to the anxious art of frontier canning, where every jar was a gamble and every hiss a potential hazard. Canning food on the American frontier wasn't just a chore, it was a seasonal gauntlet. With no refrigeration and few preservatives, families had to store summer's bounty in glass or tin containers that, if sealed improperly, could ferment, spoil, or burst in the heat. The process required patience, nerve, and often a willingness to ignore that last jar in the corner that bubbled a little too enthusiastically. Boiling jars in large pots was standard, usually over open flames, which added both inconvenience and the occasional emergency. Hot jars shattered from sudden temperature changes, lids buckled, seals failed. And if someone dared to pressure can using unregulated equipment, the results could range from soggy pickles to minor explosions. One settler wrote of a marmalade blast that covered the ceiling in peach goo for weeks. There's no scholarly consensus on when exactly canning became widespread on the frontier. Some argue it wasn't until the late 1800s that the practice truly took root, while others suggest resourceful women were sealing jars decades earlier, improvising with wax paper or string. Either way, frontier kitchens began to resemble apothecaries lined with shelves of preserved beans, tomatoes, apples, and mystery stews. A quirky workaround. Some families poured a thin layer of bacon fat over pickled vegetables to cap the jar, insulating it from air. Others used melted beeswax to seal fruits like jam and jelly, creating a sticky barrier that, at least in theory, kept out spoilage. These methods were charming, messy, and wildly inconsistent. Children were often drafted into jar inspection duty, tapping lids, sniffing contents, or just watching for signs of swelling. The worst offense, cloudiness. Cloudy liquid in a jar was like a thundercloud on the horizon. You didn't ask questions. You buried it or dumped it behind the outhouse. Yet, despite the risks, canning was revolutionary. It let people eat tomatoes in February, peaches in March, and beef stew in the depths of January. Even if the results were slightly metallic, overcooked, or inexplicably green, they were food. Predictable food. And that was worth more than gold during the long winters. Some researchers note that women who mastered canning gained a kind of culinary status in their communities. A well-stocked root cellar was a badge of honor. Recipes were guarded jars, were gifted during courtships, and entire families measured prosperity by how many quarts lined their shelves. You imagine a woman standing barefoot on the plank floor, holding up a jar of carrots like a victory trophy, proud not of the color or the cut, but of the quiet promise it made: we will eat, we will last. Canning was control. It was preparation, and sometimes it was pressure, literally. It's not gold they're digging for, it's something far more vital, more coveted, and often more elusive: salt. Out here in the wild fringes of the American frontier, salt wasn't a seasoning, it was survival. Without it, your meat rotted, your muscles cramped, and your livestock wandered off in search of minerals they didn't even know they needed. You walk alongside a wagon, creaking under the weight of barrels, not of flour or gunpowder, but of brine-soaked salt pork and precious white crystals scraped from a distant marsh. Salt was the quiet currency of frontier life, traded like treasure and guarded like secrets. Forget silverware, if you had a salt lick, you had leverage. Obtaining it wasn't easy. In salt-poor regions, families dug shallow pans into muddy flats poured in water and let the sun do the work. Days later, if the weather behaved, they'd scrape the brittle residue into sacks. Others boiled down spring water, known to carry trace minerals, watching for white rinds to crust along the pot's rim. The process was tedious and the yield modest, but a pinch of salt could preserve a winter's worth of meat, or make a bowl of wild greens taste slightly less like yard clippings. Historians continue to debate just how widely salt production was practiced versus simply relying on imports. Eastern cities had access to imported rock salt, while more remote settlements often depended on indigenous knowledge of salt springs or seasonal trading expeditions. And the lengths people went to, almost comedic. One account tells of a man who walked 200 miles with a mule just to reach a salt lick and returned with a single bag and a limp. Another tale describes settlers boiling salted animal blood into what one diary entry described as poor man's broth. The line between resourcefulness and culinary crime grew thin. Quirky detail. Some communities held salt socials, casual gatherings where neighbors swapped excess salt for seeds, needles, or gossip. A jar of salted cucumbers might earn you a pair of wool socks, a slab of cured venison, maybe even a flirtatious smile or two. Salt wasn't just about flavor, it was security. It kept illness at bay season food that would otherwise feel like punishment, and played a starring role in food preservation long before refrigeration whispered its promises. Smoke alone couldn't do the job. It needed salt to draw out moisture ward off bacteria and keep the meat from turning on you during a snowstorm. Some frontier doctors even prescribed salt as a tonic mixed with vinegar for sore throats, or rubbed into wounds with what we now understand was mixed success. Still, the belief in its power ran deep. You picture a child sneaking a crystal from the family's dwindling jar, sucking it like candy until caught. The mother sighs torn between scolding and understanding. It tastes good, but more importantly, it tastes like survival. In a world where sugar was rare and meat went gray overnight, salt was the real gold rush. And it never glittered, it just worked. The room is dim, the floor sticky, and the air smells like whiskey and pickled eggs. You've wandered into a frontier saloon, not for the drinks, but for the food. Or at least for what passes as food when you're 3 bourbons in and counting. Behind the bar, a large wooden barrel sits, open glistening with brine. Inside, something vaguely egg-shaped and floating ominously. Saloons weren't just places to drown your sorrows. They were unofficial diners, snack stands, and community forums all rolled into one. While formal meals weren't usually served, plenty of salty, shelf-stable, and strange items lined the bar. The idea was simple: keep patrons thirsty and standing. No cutlery, no comfort, just edible encouragement to keep the drinks flowing. Cracker barrels were a staple, literally. A large barrel filled with dry, brittle crackers, hardtack, really invited patrons to reach in and grab a handful. They weren't fresh. They weren't soft, but they were salty and free. Some added molasses or butter when available, while others dunked them straight into beer. Crunch, chew, sip, repeat. And then there were the pickled offerings. Eggs were the most iconic, boiled hard, and suspended in jars of vinegar salt and mystery spices. Sometimes beets were added, dyeing the eggs a deep pink that screamed, "Do not trust me." These were snacks that challenged you: rubbery texture, acidic bite, and a smell that lingered longer than most poker debts. Other jars held onions, pig's feet, or even sausages bobbing in oil. One barkeep famously served smoky beans straight from a tin, warmed on a stove, and ladled into chipped mugs. Historians still argue whether these snack boards were a culinary evolution or an act of defiance. Quirky detail. Some saloons hosted cheese nights, placing out wedges of pungent room-temperature cheddar with communal knives and zero sanitation. Pair it with crackers and a lukewarm drink, and you had yourself a frontier charcuterie minus the Instagram filter. There was often a performative element to it, too. Eating the weirdest thing on the bar became a point of pride. A traveling man might boast, "I ate 2 eggs and a pickled pig's knuckle and lived to tell it." It wasn't just sustenance, it was sport. Saloon snacks served a subtle but essential role. They slowed down intoxication just enough to keep customers upright. They kept the mouth busy, the stomach occupied, and the wallet open. Plus, they gave bartenders something to talk about besides lost cattle and broken dreams. Some researchers suggest that these food traditions migrated west from European taverns, adapted along the way to include whatever was available, fermentable, or foolish enough to be eaten. Others argue that they sprang up organically, a frontier solution to a frontier problem. Drinking on an empty stomach never ends well. You imagine reaching for a cracked egg with stained fingers, unsure whether to bite it or barter it. It's gross. It's oddly comforting. It's tradition. In a place where nothing was guaranteed, the Cracker Barrel was always full. And that was something. The table is set with chip plates, a candle stub, and one shriveled apple. It's Christmas or maybe someone's birthday, but the meal looks suspiciously like every other night. Still, everyone smiles or tries to. Because on the American frontier, holidays didn't mean feasts. They meant making the ordinary feel almost festive. Special occasion meals were less about the food and more about the effort. If someone managed to bake a pie or sweeten the stew, it was cause for celebration. But more often, celebrations meant stretching existing supplies to seem abundant. A slightly thicker biscuit, a spoonful of molasses. Maybe if the stars aligned, a sliver of dried fruit, rehydrated in something resembling brandy. One diary from a settler in Minnesota recounts a Thanksgiving dinner made of mashed turnips, burnt cornbread, and a cake with no sugar but 3 prayers. Another notes a New Year's treat of boiled cabbage served proudly because we had it. Historians still debate whether these meals were genuinely celebratory or simply dressed-up versions of daily survival. What is certain is that frontier families clung to ritual. Even if there was nothing new to eat, they rearranged the same ingredients with a sense of occasion. Pancakes stacked instead of scattered, beans served in the nice pot, tablecloths made from flour sacks. Children often received the only visible upgrades: a lump of candy, a slice of fried dough, or a dab of fruit preserve saved just for the day. These small luxuries were treasured, hoarded, and described with awe years later. One boy recalled receiving a raisin for Christmas. Singular, he split it with his sister. A quirky detail. On Valentine's Day, some frontier women dyed cornbread pink using beet juice. The effect was patchy but charming, and briefly convinced the children it was dessert. Others carved hearts into biscuits or stacked them in the shape of a cake, complete with wildflower candles. Holiday drinks followed the same pattern. If coffee was available, it might be spiced with cinnamon or mixed with goat's milk. More ambitious families brewed switchel, a mixture of vinegar water, ginger, and sweetener that tasted like an old promise and burned like one too. Eggnog. Only if someone had eggs, cream, liquor, and a miracle. Even music and laughter were rationed. Instruments were rare, so people sang or clapped spoons. Dancing meant moving the furniture and clearing the dirt floor. But it happened. Because joy wasn't a luxury, it was defiance. Some scholars argue these meals preserved a sense of normalcy. Others claim they reinforced community bonds, giving families something to look forward to, even if it was only symbolic. Either way, these gatherings mattered. The food didn't change much, but the meaning did. You imagine the family gathered passing around a single dried apple slice, each bite taken with ceremony. Someone tells a joke, someone sings off-key. The candle flickers. This is what special looked like out here, not indulgence, but intention. A reminder that even in scarcity, people made room for sweetness. The cupboard creaks. You open it knowing what's inside, not much. A crust of bread, a few beans, maybe a jar with mysterious sediment at the bottom. You're not looking for a meal, you're looking for a miracle. Because on the American frontier, survival wasn't always about cooking. Sometimes it was about making a feast out of nothing, the final stretch of winter, a failed crop, a broken wagon that never brought the sugar. These were moments when food was less about taste and more about strategy. Families learned to stretch the last spoonful of flour across multiple meals. They boiled bones until they softened into paste. They fried dough made from nothing but lard and sorrow, and they called it dinner. One journal from a homesteader in the Dakotas tells of making soup from boiled leather, not myth fact. Saddle straps softened in water and flavored with wild garlic became a meal that, while questionable in texture, kept a family alive for another day. Some settlers even ate wallpaper paste thickened with flour when supplies ran out. Historians still debate whether these accounts were widespread or rare, but even a few cases are enough to make you shiver. Quirky trade systems emerged in these times. A single button traded for a crust of bread. A pair of shoelaces swapped for 2 apples. One family reportedly bartered a patch of their roof for a bucket of cornmeal, then covered the hole with oilcloth and quiet hope. You can almost hear the quiet negotiations. A mother offering her last jar of jam to a neighbor who still had dried beans. A child with a single biscuit splitting it into quarters. A father skipping his share so the youngest could have a full spoonful. Food meant survival, yes, but it also meant relationships. Who you could trust, who remembered your need, who came back with a satchel of dried apples and a shrug, saying they were going bad anyway. That kind of generosity didn't come from wealth. It came from memory of someone else's hunger. Some researchers argue that these moments forged the tightest bonds in frontier communities. Others suggest they marked a turn toward bartering economies that shaped rural trade for decades to come. But all agree on one thing: survival meals had emotional gravity. They weren't just eaten, they were remembered. And not all of them were sad. Some families created victory recipes for when they managed to make something out of scraps. Potato peel hash, flourless pancakes, jam made from pine cones. These dishes, ridiculous as they sound, brought laughter back into the room. You picture a woman stirring a pot of almost nothing, adding a pinch of salt like it's gold. She hums, not because the food is good, but because she's still here to make it, because they're still here to eat it. The frontier menu ended not with grand finales, but with quiet triumphs. A pot, not empty a child, not crying a tomorrow still possible. The fire's low, now barely a flicker. Somewhere a pan still crackles from the warmth of memory. You can almost smell the cornmeal, and coffee feel the rough grain of a cracker barrel, hear the soft clink of a tin spoon scraping the last bit of stew. These weren't meals made for joy, but somehow they made joy possible. You've wandered through a kitchen with no walls eaten beside strangers and ghosts, and stirred stories that were equal parts smoke and grit. The food wasn't always tasty. It wasn't always food. But it told the truth about endurance, creativity, and the quiet heroism of keeping others fed when you're hungry yourself. So, if you ever find yourself facing an empty cupboard, remember this. Someone once made a pie out of squirrel, a dumpling out of lint and faith, and called it dinner. And they lived to tell the tale. If you'd like to return to stories like this, you can always subscribe quietly, of course. But before you drift off, tell me, where are you? What time is it, and who's your favorite forgotten historical figure?